Hello students. So, this is another little discussion in the area of reading comprehension. In a previous discussion, we have talked about effective reading and what you can do to improve on that. We are going to take that thought a little further this time into getting into a little bit of detail into what we would call critical reading, right. But before we get to critical reading, let me just run a quick recap of what was the effective reading content. I have it on the slide here. Do remember that when reading, what is it you need to keep track of is you need to understand ideas and their support, you need to be able to grasp idea flow, you need to know the overall picture which revolves in some sense around the main or central idea, you need to be able to understand style and tone, and all of this you need to be able to recognize how they work together, and where reasoning is involved, that means where opinions are involved, you also need to keep track of the reasons that back those opinions, right. This is what the content of the last discussion was. Okay. So, now that we have just reminded ourselves of that, we will move on to what we really mean by critical reading. Okay. Now, when we say critical reading, you might be, when you look at the slide there, you might say, but this looks very similar to the previous slide that we had. Yes, but listen to what I am going to say, because it is really something else that we need to keep in mind now. I told you in the previous session when we talked about paying attention to vocabulary that interpretation of meaning is necessary, but the point is now we have got to also start asking why this word and why not something else. Now, when somebody uses a particular word, you recognize that it has a specific meaning, it also has a contextual meaning, and it also holds out possibilities. So, the point is when you say why this particular word, why not another word that could have been used here, you recognize there is something about this word that puts in some implications that you have to pay attention to. So, this whole business of critical reading would mean that I pay attention to why particular words are being used, what are the possibilities that they hold, right. So, whether they are words or phrases or idioms or figures of speech or whatever, ask yourself whether this holds out any possibilities of continuation, holds out any possibilities that I should watch out for, alright. Now, similarly when it comes to questions, right, to sentences. So, when you are looking at sentences where you are talking about the tools that are used or the roles that particular phrases and words play, again you have to ask yourself, if this was structured in this way, why was it structured in this way? For instance, a person might might give you a statement about something happening, but might start about somebody doing something, but might start it with the reason. For instance, if I say being a hardworking person, Ashok is always able to complete his tasks on time. You realize my main idea there is Ashok always completes his tasks on time. Now, I could have said Ashok completes his tasks on time because he is a hardworking person, but I started it with being a hardworking person. In other words, while my key idea is Ashok is let us say able to finish his tasks on time, I would like you to look at it in the aspect of, I would like you to look at it with his hard work in the background. That means you are already aware that he is a hardworking guy, and therefore the connection to his, very clearly the main idea maybe he finishes his work on time, but the focus through which one has approached that main idea is the background of his hard work. You understand what I mean? So, the point is, why is a particular sentence written a certain way? What kind of value does the key idea give me, and what kind of value do the subordinate ideas give me? Do they hold out possibilities that I need to take forward? Do they hold out, let us say, ideas which let us say the structure of which tell me that there is more that can come here and I need to keep that in mind, right. And then you also pay attention to the reasoning. So, we talked about that also earlier, but that is still something that we must keep in mind. I must be able to recognize opinion, I must be able to see basis, I must be able to connect that basis and understand what the line of thinking is. I must be able to recognize the flow of an argument, which means how does this basis add up. That means there is an opinion here, what elements in this passage are actually basis for this opinion, how does these elements add up, what is the thinking that caused them to that caused the author to arrive at this kind of conclusion. Now, once I know that, then I would also know what else this person must have used. I can work out what his assumptions are, I can recognize how this thing can actually be supported, under what circumstances it will continue to be valid, under what kind of possibilities can impact on it, and then I will watch out for those things. For instance, if somebody gives me arguments which are worded in very limited fashion, I will ask myself, why is he limiting it? What are the circumstances he is going to present that I need to watch out for? Or if someone gives me arguments that seem very large in their scope, I have got to be a little careful and say, is it as large as it seems, or is he going to give me limiting factors later on? So, what we are talking about when we say critical reading is, it is about not just paying attention to what it is that the page has, it is also about paying attention to what the possibilities are that they bring about. All right, it's about considering what you read, it's about thinking about it. All right, so you would call this critical reading or active reading. The point is to be inquisitive, to excite your mind a bit in terms of what is that word, what does it hold, what is that sentence, what does it hold as possibilities, what kind of connections is likely, and when you come across those connections, you realize you'll be able to pick them up easier, isn't it? Because you anticipated something and what you anticipated did come about, you are able to pick it up much faster than if you had to labor over it and then try and figure out what it's doing then. All right. So, if you are going to read regularly and extensively, like we said in the last discussion, this whole ability of critical reading also is something that you can add to yourself, and that means that your reading would be really, really effective. Let us just move on to the next discussion then. So, in short, what do we mean by critical reading? We are saying you go beyond what the words and the sentences just mean. That means don't just look at what they say on paper and interpret them for what they mean. Consider the possibilities that they hold and think of what they do. That means these things mean something, but they are doing something here along with other things. What's the networking that happens? How do they support each other? I've got to work all of that out. I've got to consider the possibilities as well. So, think of what the text does. Think of what the elements of the text do, what purpose they serve, and not just what they mean. All right. Now, let us try one here. We've got a sentence there and I have a sample that you can look at. So, it's a very simple sentence. Now, for instance, if you've got it on the slide, it says 90% of China's thermal power plants use coal. Now, when you read that statement, it would seem that the information that it provides to me is very obvious. Fair enough. But the point is, if I were to just leave it at that, meaning if I were to just take that information in and carry on, then I am not really doing this critical thinking bit. I am not really considering what the possibilities are that this sentence holds. So, let me explain this to you. Now, the moment you read 90%, I think a little bulb should go off in your head saying, but this is not complete, because 90% is not complete, there is another 10% somewhere. So, there is a question you have to ask yourself, not do I know what the other 10% are. This guy says 90% of China's thermal power plants. So, there is another 10% of China's thermal power plants not discussed here. Is this person going to discuss them? Now, just keep the question alive, because if that discussion happens, you will recognize that information even as you approach it, even as you see it, because you actually had the gate open. If I didn't consider the possibility that there is another 10% coming up, when that 10% does come up, let us assume he does not use the word 10%, he just gives me a descriptive statement. When that happens, I do not connect it to this. I understand it, but I understand it independently. I do not connect it to this because I did not actually see it coming. So, the point is the 90% itself should tell me that I must watch for another 10% in case this guy talks about it. Will he talk about it? Not necessarily. But if he does, I should be able to catch it, right. 90% of what? China's thermal power plants. Now, the moment someone says China's, you realize they are using the possessive proper noun, right. Now, when they say China's, what are the possibilities that come out of that? Now, again you have to ask yourself, I mean straight away it strikes you that this guy is saying China's something over here. He might actually discuss China's other capacities in, let us say, in the power generation business. So, let me watch out for that, because those will be connected bits of information. The other possibility is he is talking about China's thermal power plants here. He could very well be comparing these to the power plants that belong to another country. So, let me watch out for that comparison if it happens. So, in other words, this dual possibilities here, I just keep both alive, so that when one does come about, I am able to make the connection straight off, and if another one comes about later, then I would make that connection as well. So, the point is, think 90% I should think ahead, China's I should think ahead. Now, thermal power plants. Now, we know what a thermal power plant is, so that is not the discussion here. Why would anyone describe power plants as thermal? Now, you might say that is because they are thermal, they use heat and they boil water and all that. But the point is, let's just look at it this way. Suppose China had only thermal power plants. Let's just suppose, for argument's sake, that China had only thermal power plants and the whole world knew this. Then would we have to say 90% of China's thermal power plants? No, we will simply say 90% of China's power plants. In other words, why are we saying 90% of China's thermal power plants? Because obviously China has power plants other than thermal also. The very fact that you describe the thermal means that the non-thermal also exists, or it is possible that they exist. So, what you watch out for is, okay, he is talking about thermal power plants here, is he also going to talk about the non-thermal ones? If he is, let me pay attention to that as well and connect it to this, because then I will get a much better understanding of China's total generation capacity. You get it? So, that means even as you read this line, there are 3 bits there that should cause you to look ahead. 90% causes you to look ahead for another 10, is it coming up? China's causes you to look ahead at more information about China or a comparison. Thermal power plants cause you to look ahead to what about the non-thermal ones, are they going to discuss them, right? Now, straight away 90% of China's thermal power plants use coal means 10% use something else. Is he going to tell me what else they use? Fine. Also, now let us go beyond the sentence itself and do some extended thinking. Now, when a writer, now assuming that this writer has, you've read this in an article in a magazine written, let us say a news magazine, you realize that this is not a magazine written for 4-year-olds or for 5-year-olds or for 6-year-olds. It is written for people who have finished school or who are in college or who are working, people who have a general grasp of things happening around them, at least to some extent. So, now when the person says use coal, would you say that it, in which case it is quite, what should we say, understandable, if the author expects me to know something about coal. Of course, the author would expect you to know about coal. At your age, he is not going to now explain to you what coal is. So, if he expects that you know something about coal, then you do some extended thinking and you ask, so is he going to talk about where they are getting the coal from? Is he going to talk about how much, how limited or unlimited their resources are? Is he going to talk about what kind of trade arrangements they have to get this coal, right? Now, you might say, how do I know he is going to talk about these things? You do not know. You just keep the possibilities open in your mind, so that when the whatever he is going to talk about happens, you make the connection straight off. He might not talk about all the possibilities you thought of, so you abandon them. But the ones that do happen, because you anticipated them, you are able to connect, isn't it? Also, last point, is the author justified in believing that my reader knows about China? Now, I might not know all the nitty-gritty about China, but he is certainly justified, the author is justified in believing that I know that China is the world's largest country, it has the world's largest population. I mean, that is bound to be the case, right? So, if that is the case, then straight away some lateral thinking. Is he going to tell me, I mean, considering that they are such a large country and they must be having a great number of thermal power plants, in which case that is using hell of a lot of coal, in which case they are diminishing resources and they are adding pollution to the environment. Is he going to discuss those areas? Is he going to talk about protection of resources and protection of the environment? I do not know if he is going to talk about them. I am just keeping the gate open. And when he does talk about things, it is because I have thought about prior possibilities that the adding up happens, and that means anticipation is smooth and my reading continues at a reasonably quick pace. So, you realize what we really mean by critical reading then. It is about not just understanding what the person is saying, but trying to think about it, consider it, connect ideas and go ahead. Now, for instance, I will give you an analogy here which I think will sum this thing up. When we talk about the use of our ears, we have only 2 words for them. I mean, we have 2 words for them. We have hearing and we have listening. Now, you know the difference between that. Hearing is just allowing the sounds to bounce off your eardrums. Listening is where you actually take it in, you consider it, you connect it to things that you know, you look at possibilities. That is what listening is. Now, reading for that matter, we have only 1 word. We have only reading. Nobody really uses another word. But they do not need to, because reading was never meant to be like hearing. Reading was always meant to be like listening. Reading has always required that you consider things that you look at. Alright. So, that is what we are really considering here. Now, we will move forward to a slide in which we look at a couple of samples and then you will understand what we are talking about. So, we have a sample here. I will take you through it and we will look at why particular words are used, why particular comparisons are used, what it brings to mind and so on and so forth. This one is relatively simple, but let us just discuss it. Like a boil that can never be cured as long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its pus flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Up to now, except for the word like there, he has given me the situation of a boil. He has given me the situation of a boil and how it is that you need to tackle a boil. You need to open it up and expose its ugliness to natural light and air. Like that, injustice must be likewise exposed with all of the tension its exposing creates. Now, what is the word tension doing there? Why would exposing, see, we are not talking about in the case of a boil. First of all, he did not talk about tension with the boil, but obviously when you are saying boil opened with all its pus flowing ugliness to the natural medicines, the opening of the boil itself is unpleasant, therefore that causes tension. plus the incision and the cutting off of the boil is probably going to cause a certain amount of pain. There is going to be some unhappiness, and therefore the opening of a boil is never a happy occasion. For one, the one who is doing it, it's unpleasant. For people looking on, it's unpleasant. For the person who is undergoing it, it's painful. So there is pain involved in that, and he says in the same manner there is going to be pain involved in this as well. And really you realize that's true. The point is, he is not telling us what that pain is, but you realize injustice must be likewise exposed with all of the tension exposing creates. The point is, when I expose injustice, I might be placing myself at risk. When I expose injustice, I might be causing embarrassment to those who were quietly suffering that injustice. When I expose injustice, I am placing society at risk sometimes, because if this is an oppressor I am talking about, I might run the risk of greater oppression. So that then is the tension of its exposing. So injustice must be likewise exposed with all the tension of its that its exposing creates to the light of human conscience. When actually it is under human gaze, under awareness, then the very fact that it is out in the open and people are viewing it and have an opinion on it is likely to curb whoever it is that who's engaging that injustice, so this person feels, and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. And again, people must voice their opinions on this. Is this injustice? Is it not injustice? If it's injustice, why is it injustice? What is unjust about it? How should it be dealt with? And only when human conscience actually is aware of it and is disapproving of it, and human debate takes care of discussing how it should be dealt with, can injustice itself be cured. So on the face of it, it seems, like a straightforward analogy. Just like a boil, injustice is like a boil. Just like you cut open a boil and expose it to the air, you cut open corruption and expose it to conscience and national opinion, it will be cured. But that is a simplification. What about this pain that he is talking about? What about this tension that it exposes? I have got to think in terms of, okay, what is the tension that happens when a pus boil is opened? And I have just discussed that. And then why is he talking about the tension? Because similar tension, not similar, but there are equal, or at least analogous tensions that happens when injustice is exposed. Pain, oppression, embarrassment, shame, all of this is going to happen. Sometimes society itself might be ashamed to pick it up because they have been keeping quiet for so long that they haven't wanted to discuss it so far, but they must face up to it and discuss it now. It's like there are so many things that we just keep quiet about because we don't want to talk about them, but they are injustice anyway. So even if it's going to cause us embarrassment and pain and suffering, we've got to come out with it, because only then can it actually be something that everyone is aware of and it's subject to discussion, so that it gets in some sense cured. So what is the idea flow here? That injustice is like sepsis, and what is the summation? To be properly cleared and dealt with, it must be exposed. But that idea flow is not is a literal translation of what we've got. The rest of what we've discussed is what we've read between the lines, what our critical thinking has allowed us to do. Yeah. And is there a tone in this? Yes, the tone is of a person who's recommending to us a particular path that we should follow. We'd call this sermonizing. The person is really saying, this is what we should do, let us not support injustice, let us speak about this. Is like a sermon, like a big lecture somebody is giving us. And what is the style? The style, that means the pattern in which it is done, is a comparative analogy. He is giving you a situation, he is giving you a metaphoric situation and relating it to the aspect that he wants to talk about. We call that analogy. Okay, so that's the style that he's used. Let's move on to one more sample. So let's take this one. This one is a little complicated, so listen carefully, read, listen to the discussion, and you'll understand why I am saying critical reading is so important. Now, the man of words, duly instructed, dips the pen of desire in the ink of devotedness and proceeds to spread it over the page of desolation. Then the nightingale of affection is heard to warble to the rose of loveliness, while the breeze of anxiety plays around the brow of expectation. That is what the Easterns are said to consider fine writing, to which the school of critics subscribes. Let's deal with each of these. The easiest one here is the man of words. We know the man of words can only be a person who uses language either to speak or to write. Fine. So the man of words, that is possibly the one thing here that is fairly straightforward. We know who they are talking about. You are talking about a writer perhaps. How do we know we are not talking about a speaker? Because at the end he is talking about fine writing. So I know he is talking about a writer. Then he says, duly instructed. Now duly instructed, we normally use the word instructed to mean ordered. But let's not forget that instructed also comes from instruction. So instruction is not just orders, instruction is also teaching, instruction is also guidance. So this might not necessarily be the person who is duly ordered, because later you realize that we are talking about somebody who really wants to share things, really doing it willingly. So it can't be one who is ordered, it is one who has learnt how to do. So the duly instructed here could mean a person who has been properly taught, or a person who has taught himself or herself. So a person who now knows what to do and how to do it, then proceeds to do this. Does what? Dips the pen of desire. Now if the writer is holding the pen, then whose desire must it be? It must be the writer's desire. Desire for what? Why do we write? We desire to share our thoughts. So dips the pen of desire. The pen here is the business of what it is he is going to use to write. I do not mean writing implement, I mean he is going to use the medium of writing, and the medium is of desire to share ideas. So dips a pen of desire to share his ideas in the ink of devotedness. Devotedness to what? Devotedness to the ideas that he wants to share. So this desire to share is then takes the ink of devotedness, that means the matter that he wants, that he is devoted to, that he is interested in, that he wants to share, and proceeds to spread it over the page of desolation. Now proceeds to spread it, that means he proceeds to disseminate it or pass it on over a page of desolation. Now are we talking about desolation as in sadness here? It is not necessarily so, because he might be talking about non-sad things also. The desolation here is about emptiness. In other words, he is filled with ideas that he is devoted to, and he would like to share it with those people who do not have those ideas, who are empty of those ideas. So that is what he means by page of desolation here. So he would like to share these ideas with those who do not have ideas, or these particular kinds of ideas that I am devoted to. So he takes his desire to share his views on things that he is interested and devoted to. He then proceeds to put it down in writing so as to be able to share it with those who are empty of these ideas, right? Okay. Then the nightingale of affection is heard to warble to the rose of loveliness. Now a nightingale warbles to a rose. To warble to a rose is to sing of love to a rose. Now you are saying, I mean, he is using metaphors here to say that the bird is singing to something that it finds lovely. The bird is singing to something that it finds lovely. What have we just done here? The person has turned out a piece of writing, and therefore if he has prompted interest in his reader, then the reader is drawn to this writing. The reader then is in that sense the nightingale. What is the affection? The interest that this person has evoked in the reader, right? And is heard to warble to the rose of life, is heard to appreciate the matter written, right? So the nightingale of affection is, the nightingale is the reader's what shall we say, awakened perceptions, let us say, of affection, and that is the appeal towards what is written, is heard to warble to, that means is now appreciative of the rose of loveliness, that is the matter that this person has actually shared with them. Fine. While the breeze of anxiety plays around the brow of expectation. Now we are talking about the reader having appreciated, then whose anxiety? Not the reader's anxiety, it is the writer's anxiety. The writer is anxious until, because he has an expectation. The expectation is that I hope my reader actually gets what I want to tell them, and I expect they will, because I have taken some pains over it. So while the breeze of anxiety, so moving from what the reader is doing in terms of expressing or being appreciative of what he is reading, on the other hand the writer is still in some sense a little anxious, because he would like to know that what it is that he expects the reader to get, the reader gets. In other words, you realize what this person is saying. He says a writer, this writer he is talking about, is not washing his hands of things at the moment it is done. He is staying with it in the hope and until, at least until such point of time, that he realizes that people who have read it have actually in some sense been able to pick up everything that he wants to give them, right? Now that is what the Eastern, so he is not talking about all writing here. He says that is what the Easterns are said to consider fine writing. So these Easterns, whoever they are of the view that this is what fine writing is. So now we understand that the Easterns are of the view that fine writing is not just about the writing alone, it is about the intent behind the writing, and it is also about the intent to deliver the message as effectively as possible, and the fact that the writer has a responsibility in some sense of doing that, and the writer is aware of that responsibility. He realizes that his job is done when the message has actually gone across effectively, right? So that is what the Easterns are said to consider fine writing, to which the school of critics subscribes. Now when we say to which the school of critics subscribes, now think about that. Are we saying that the school of critics also thinks that is fine writing? No. We are saying that is what the Easterns are said to consider fine writing. Who says so? This school of critics says so. To which the school of critics subscribes? The school of critics subscribes to the view that Easterners consider fine writing to be thus. You get it? So now, if on reading this I came to the conclusion that the Easterners and some critics believe that this is fine writing, that would be wrong. The Easterners consider this to be fine writing, and there is a school of critics that actually have subscribe to the view that this is what Easterners call fine writing. So that means, in the view of some critics, Easterners call this fine writing. What is this? Everything that we just discussed. Alright. So you realize that, one, working out the analogy; two, why is this analogy being made? Why is he using the words that he does? And three, let me be accurate about the interpretation of the sentences, so I know whose views I am really talking about and not get my interpretation wrong. So again, we have done some fairly careful thinking here. Now you might say, but this is really involved stuff. I am actually, I very confidently assure you that if you make reading a regular habit, and if you think about it as you do it, soon enough this will become the way you read, and it will not be time consuming or tedious. It will actually be smooth. Alright. So let us sum up what the thing here is. The idea flow in this is, then a writer who is either taught or has learnt writes to create appeal or to evoke interest where there is emptiness in the ideas. That means he would like to share his ideas with those who do not have the ideas. And then, while the interest may be evoked and the reader does get interested, the writer remains anxious until he is certain that the objective, namely to share these ideas, has been achieved. And this, according to certain critics, is what the Easterners call fine writing. This is what the Easterners call fine writing, and certain critics believe as such, right. So this then, according to certain critics, is what the Easterners call fine writing. What kind of tone did we have here? It was descriptive, because you can see he's used an analogy, but the kind of descriptions, he's used some very, what should we say, evocative words, things that are very, lots of imagery here. So he's used very descriptive language, but what's the style? It is explanatory. He is using an analogy, all right, but to explain what he believes or what the Easterns believe fine writing to be. So you realize that from these two samples that critical reading requires that you pay attention and you consider the things that you are looking at. But I mean, surely you do a regular bit of reading and you think actively when you read, soon enough this kind of reading will be part of the way you function, and it will not be a problem at all. And then you will really be comprehending, and reading comprehension will be as smooth as well, not exactly a knife through butter, but not difficult at all. Alright. So try all of this. All the best.